Hi there, I'm back with the second half of this walkthrough video for my PowerPoint for the 3D module of Humanities 1010 at UVU. And we will start with elements, so aspects of sculpture that help the students describe what they see and work their way toward an interpretation. Basically, I start outlining elements here that would connect back to the first step that I suggest in my lesson plan, namely a very brief opening session with the students where they just brainstorm on what you can do in 3D that you can't do in 2D. So I am listing the formal elements, which I also put together on an HTML list under the name of Elements of 3D Art Analysis and Interpretation that the students can pull up at any time. And I'm breaking these formal elements down into two sets. The first one is a set of things that now in 3D become both actual and implied. Some things that were only implied or could only be implied in 2D art that are now also have an actual element. And so it is important to note that these are still aesthetic categories. So even though 3D sculpture does have the opportunity to have actually mass and texture and sometimes even movement, these things still will be first of all approached from an aesthetic point of view, and that the actual and the implied might not always be identical, which again is not possible in 2D art. So this is a maybe complicated thought that is also very interesting to point out right from the beginning. So I'm taking the first four here, first four from the list, and want the students to kind of focus on these at the, basically four at a time. As we're looking at this fantastic example, I think Deborah Butterfield is a Western artist. The Art Museum of the University of Utah has one of her horses. I've seen one at the San Francisco airport. And I got this idea from Nancy Rushforth many years ago, so this is not original with me, but it's just a wonderful example for how your sense of space, texture, and temperature intertwines with your idea of the mass of this sculpture. You will need to tell the students that it is life-size. You can ask them what they think the material is, and they will say, looks like driftwood. And because driftwood is so paper light, the sense of the sculpture is also, because there's so much negative space, is also a good example of talking about negative and positive space. It seems to be a very light sculpture, which would be aesthetically a tension between your sense of how heavy a horse is. But then to turn this around again, you reveal that this is actually bronze, and that the impression that the horse gives is actually faulty, so that they've got an aesthetic and an actual sense of mass here at work, which is, I think, what this artwork ultimately is about. You can apply the same categories to these two sculptures, which will be with us throughout the rest of the PowerPoint because they're such wonderfully contrasting examples. Lots of negative space on the left, more than on the right, even though you've got these interlocking triangles in that sculpture on the right. So texture, the Giacometti is, I've got some details here. I took some photographs at the MoMA to give the students a sense of how incredibly thin this sculpture is, and also what the texture of it is. So it's not very inviting. It seems rough. It is distorted. It is almost not there. It's a little bit smaller than life size. And just on the other side, the malleole gives a sense of solidity. It's almost like a centripetal force that comes from it, as opposed to the centrifugal pointing of the other sculpture, and the gravity of the contemplation, the inward movement of everything that comes from that sculpture is accentuated also by, of course, the greater mass, where everything seems to be going away from the Giacometti. So again, talking just about a couple of aspects of analysis, you immediately start moving toward interpretation. There's another picture of the Mediterranean. You can see that it's actually not green. So I said this is from 1905. Actually, that's a little imprecise. The original bronze was from 1905. This is a later marble version that Malleole did, and it is, I think, slightly more abstracted. So the modernist influence makes itself felt. So when you talk about lifelikeness, at the end of the class, when this sculpture is again going to be a topic, you might want to point out that this is actually not entirely proportioned right. It is, the limbs are kept shorter so that this encircling overall composition is brought out more. So it's also a little bit abstract. It's an early modernist work, really. This is from 1932, so high modernism. Movement, of course, actual movement versus implied movement. Discus throw hasn't moved in 2,000 years. And 2,500 years, but you get a sense of the dynamic. It's like a coil. He's like a coiled spring, right? You can feel the movement already, but there's no movement there. Usually there isn't in 2D art, except that, of course, now, since the 20th century, you also have kinetic artworks, and you know all about that. I think you probably talked about the fact that the Duchamp it was the very first sculpture with a moving part in it, which might alleviate their doubts about whether this is art again. You might not have won over all the students when you first talked about Duchamp under ready-made. And this is actually a video here. The caller, it should run for you, but hey, it's not running for me right now. Why not? Ha 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 ha. I don't know why. I guess I have to fix that. Sometimes it loads properly and then it runs. It's a video of the Calder sculpture actually moving. You might want to turn the sound off. It has some annoying music on it, it's annoying because the Calder himself also experimented with sculptures that made sounds as well. So to have sound added doesn't seem quite right. It's a Christie's video, so at the end it says how much this thing sells for or sold for, and of course the students will gasp. A little bit of an opportunity to say that the monetary value of artworks is a completely separate realm that does not necessarily intrinsically have anything to do with art, but something to do with any market dynamic, supply and demand and so forth. So. Okay, lifelikeness abstraction is of course an interesting one. One of the goals of this section is to talk about the different functions of lifelikeness and abstraction in 3D art. And Alexander Calder is again our example, so we've got a lot of Calder here. The red flamingo as a first example of abstraction. So one of the things that I have always tried to bring out by talking about Brancourt's Spirit in Space, for instance, is that abstraction is a little bit different from stylization. And when we talk about the Woman of Willendorf later in the PowerPoint, sorry about that, in the PowerPoint, I return to that, usually I return to that idea. So here I will ask them, okay, so without the title, we probably wouldn't have much of an idea, but now that you know it's called Bird in Space, how can you tell that it is a bird? And so they will come up with things like, the aerodynamics design of it, that it could be a beak or a wing or a tail or something like that it might look like a bird flitting through the air, all these different associations. And when we get to talk about the Venus of Willendorf, I'll talk about stylization. And I usually at that point in the class, and maybe you can do this on the whiteboard and canvas as well, I draw a picture of, for instance, the symbol on a lady's bathroom, and I say, so this is a stylization, so that everybody will immediately recognize that this is the ladies' room. So it's a stylization that will steer you in one particular direction. There's really not much of a range of possible interpretations. Whereas abstraction in modern art has really the opposite function of opening up a field of interpretation. So these are the two big differences that I see between abstraction and stylization. A good example would be to compare the brancush here with a drawing of a bird like it usually appears in the sky of seascapes, that typical short signature emulation of the bird form, which everybody will immediately recognize to be a bird, whereas here you'll have to think for a little while, right? And there's also a spatial element and a movement element that is being suggested. So now a second set of formal elements concerning the analysis of 3D art. So these are elements that either are specific only to 2D art or become more complicated to 2D art. So they're a little bit different from the first set of formal elements mentioned. And then we walk through them again, some of them simultaneously with this example. So have fun with that. And again, the contrast I think helps to bring things out. And here I, just for context, because we talk about environment here in a little bit, also the statue that's right next to the man pointing. Somebody thought there needed to be a gender supplement, right? So the woman standing was also not much more there than the man pointing is. Size, scale, something you don't talk about quite as much in painting, even though it's not insignificant. Shocking how big the David really is. I forget sometimes. And you can also talk about proportion here, because I think in this particular picture you can see really well that the head is too large, and why that is, but you all know the answer to that. Found this really neat scale chart. Statue of Unity, the 240-meter high sculpture of an Indian leader for the unification of India. Was completed only 2 years ago, so this is a really new one, the one on the left. Shocking how small the David is compared to the other sculptures. Of course, with scale, very importantly, it means size compared to the human frame. So, how do you feel in the presence of a statue that is life size, or a statue that is smaller than life size, versus a statue that is 240 meters high? Environment, important for all sculpture. Of course, it's not insignificant where you hang your paintings in the museum or in your home. But for sculpture, since it is taking up a certain space, more significant, also often created specifically for particular spaces. An old photograph of the David outside in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. Of course, gives you a sense of scale with a lantern right next to it. And let the students just give you some ideas. Of course, opportunity to point out that when displayed in public like this, David was wearing his little fig leaf. Now, this is something that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work. I leave it up to you whether you try it. I was completely intrigued and blown away by how beautiful the brancush statues looked at the MoMA, the way that they were grouped together. So this is a decision a curator made, but the environment that each of these sculptures should have. And I think you will immediately see why, because they kind of belong, they all express a similar idea. They're all bird-like abstract sculptures, some more abstract than others. They have these different textures, they have these different temperatures, they have these different colors. It's just extremely pleasing. The students might not immediately react to this because they still have, a lot of them still have some aversion to abstract art, but you can ask them whether it helps you to understand the idea of birdness more by looking at the bird in space in conjunction with these other two sculptures or not. And usually they can articulate some ideas about that. Here's a close-up between the bird in space and the most obviously bird-shaped of those three sculptures. So these are pictures, it's the picture I took at the MoMA. Of course, with the spiral jetty, again, environmental art, environment is everything. You couldn't have the sculpture without the environment. If you haven't said it before, that you actually have to go out into pretty much nowhere to get to the spiral jetty is part of the idea. That you cannot put it in a museum is the idea. So you can revisit environmental art again here as well. And so this ties back also to our your discussion from the last session, where hopefully you spent quite a bit of time talking about environmental art. Okay, so now this is the time for group work coming up. So we're focusing on aspects of the human in 3D art. I formulated the questions in what I wrote in the lesson plan instructions as well. The guiding question is, how do these sculptures represent the human form? What do they seem to communicate about what it means to be human, what it is like to be human? So for a warm-up, start with the woman of Willendorf. Again, this is the moment to maybe go back to abstraction and talk about stylization and versus abstraction. So clearly, if you do want to compare to the David or not, this is up to you. I sometimes tell the students that she was in Hellboy 2. If you don't know the movie, don't bother. But much better than it for what it is than one would expect. It's a Guillermo del Toro movie. So starts with a gigantic woman of Willendorf, which is hilarious. I told her the people who made the film definitely knew, definitely had taken Humanities 1010. So woman of Willendorf versus the David is a fun thing. Here I've got this great picture that tells you, after you start talking about her, how small she actually is, as opposed to in the movie. Just found this recently. The alternative text for this, the auto-generated text that the computer gives you for accessibility purposes, said it was one big teddy bear. All right. So again, David in all his glory now. So compared with a woman of Willendorf, what was important to the artist, and what was he trying to communicate about the human condition, about human potential, about the human form. So then divide them into groups. And so I have done it this way, and it worked really well. Having 2 students, or maybe 3, depending on how many students you have, get together, and each of the groups discuss a different example. So one group gets this. They have a lot to go on already, since we talked about this for a while. But now the question is, what does it tell you about being human? If you do not need all the subjects, if you don't have that many groups, you can skip this one because we'd already talked about these sculptures. But these are, of course, interesting. Different periods of verism. The boy with the thorn in his foot and the Rodin. Of course, this is a first opportunity to have the students figure out what realism is in sculpture. And in general, again, we already talked about it some in previous modules. So there are similarities between the 2 sculptures. They will, of course, talk about youth and old age. But then, of course, there's this underlying element of showing things as they are. And so maybe if you have enough groups, you might want to assign this one of these sculptures in comparison to the David as well, to see how realism and idealism are very different approaches. Then the Hansen and the seagull form a pretty good pair to go together, because they're both working in relatively easy to handle media to bring out something about the human that the David does not. But I think you already know where this is going. And then everybody's favorite. So this I would not compare to anything else, but would just give the students these images of this sculpture so that they get a sense of what the sculpture looks like altogether. This always makes for a very strong reaction. So the students actually will like talking about this. They'll get pretty vivid because they have a very strong reaction to this. There have been students who have said they would like to kick it or kill it, and other students who felt reminded of their newborns or two-month-old babies who had a positive response. But this is what it's all about, isn't it? So we'll see what you can do with this. This is a post-humanist artwork. And then we've got two more explicitly post-humanist artworks, this artwork and this. And again, the students will have a strong reaction, particularly to this one. But since it is relatively obvious, I think it's enriched by doing the comparison, because these two artists mean two different things by post-human. And so it would be interesting for the students to find out what that is. So those are the ideas, and I hope that you will be able to use some of them in your own design of class.